Good afternoon. I'm Karen Dawes from the Federation of Awarding Bodies. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar on security and high stakes online testing, the big picture, this afternoon, which is being delivered by PSI, a platinum supplier of the Federation of Awarding Bodies. There'll be the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any, please enter them into the question screen on the right-hand side. I'll now hand over to John Weiner, Chief Science Officer, and Adam Freeman, VP Client Solutions at PSI. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I'm John Weiner, Chief Science Officer at PSI. My background at PSI is a lead research strategy, assessment content, and PSI's Science Advisory Board. I've been in the industry, the assessment industry, for over 30 years. And one thing that hasn't changed is the importance of test security. So I'm very pleased to be speaking on this topic today. I would consider my areas of expertise to include testing and measurement, psychometrics, validation and fairness, legal defensibility, and of course, the application of technology in assessment.
And hi, everybody. I'm Adam Freeman. So I'm the VP of Client Solutions at PSI. So I'm responsible for the solutions and products and services that we put together to work for our clients. I've been within the industry for about 15 years, working for awarding organizations as well as different assessment technology organizations. And I think from my perspective, my areas of expertise are really on solution management, product development, and supporting clients' ideas and initiatives. And it's a pleasure speaking to you today.
And so by way of introduction, just to tee up the session, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that high-stakes exam programs today, really more than ever, are subject to security risks, and these risks can potentially undermine the integrity of the program. So needless to say, security remains a key concern. The risks are well known. Certainly we're concerned with cheating, collusion, proxy testing, overexposure that can lead to compromise of the test, and then just outright theft of intellectual property that can compromise the exams. And the impact is far-reaching. Of course, these different threats can undermine the validity and fairness of an exam and add significant costs to a program. To replace a test item or an examination can be quite costly and thereby reduce the value of the program. And certainly when it comes to high-stakes testing, when public safety or consumer protection is at risk, the stakes are even higher. So in today's session, we have a nice mix of modern approaches to test security that leverage technology to address some of these security threats. Today, we're going to be talking about automated test assembly, online remote proctoring, the role of artificial intelligence in remote proctoring, and the area of data forensics. I'll get started by talking about automated test assembly, and I'll be exploring kind of an overview and benefits. So first of all, let's begin by acknowledging that exam programs for many years have used alternate test forms as one mechanism to help address test security issues. This is a long-standing practice, probably as long as tests have been used. There's been at least a second test form. And the aim has been to create a barrier to cheating. We want to reduce the exposure of content. And we want to avoid compromising the exam. And having multiple forms of the test is certainly one way to inoculate against these risks. However, publishing and maintaining fixed forms can be very time-consuming, and it's very hard to do this on a large scale. Certainly we can develop 2, 5, 10 forms of a test, even 20. Test developers can assemble these fixed forms and it's manageable. But how about hundreds of forms or even thousands? This is where automated test assembly comes into play. So to introduce what I'm talking about when I talk about automated test assembly, I'm really talking about a class of methods that use computer modeling to essentially replicate what test developers and psychometricians do to build an exam. This can be modeled in software. And this flowchart really illustrates what I'm talking about, some of the key elements of automated test assembly, really whatever method happens to be used. And the foundation really is having an item bank. So the focus is on the item bank and not so much on a specific form of the test. So creating a bank of items that is curated to a test blueprint, to a content domains and so forth is really a fundamental step. Calibrating the test items statistically is one of the next components. And there are really two main approaches here. One is based on classical test theory, the other item response theory. Both methods can be used. Each has its advantages. We tend to lean more towards CTT in our use of automated test assembly, but both are feasible. Now, in the third box, where we talk about establishing test form parameters, here what we're talking about is creating the target values for the psychometric properties of the test that can be used to assemble the exams too. This is what a psychometrician might do in manually assembling test form, and the same can be done in software. So when we get to the next box with iterative test construction, this is really at the heart of automated test assembly. There are different algorithms and models for doing this. One of the most popular is linear on-the-fly testing, or LOFT, and I'll be explaining that in a moment on the next slide. Another approach that's used, probably not as widely, is computer adaptive testing and a version of that called multi-stage testing. Whatever method is used, the end result is to produce equivalent scores on the exam so that candidates can be compared on a similar metric. But this gives you a visual for what we mean by automated test assembly. So as I said, I'm going to expand a little bit on linear on-the-fly testing. We developed an approach to this. Time flies, but it's been a couple of decades now, and have applied this method widely. As you can see in the schematic, I won't dwell on it too much, but the slides, I believe, will be available later, and you can study this. But essentially, it follows that same type of flow, where from an item bank, we establish target test parameters, we create a random forms, we establish a preliminary test form, we evaluate the properties of the test, and then there's an evaluation as to whether that form is equivalent and meets all of the standards for acceptability. And if not, the computer just discards it, and if it's accepted, it keeps going. Now, of course, with the computer capabilities of millions of bits per second, we can generate thousands and thousands of forms in a matter of seconds. So as I say, this has been used to assess, at this point, over the decades, billions of candidates. So it's a very stable process. Key features are that a unique equivalent form is delivered to each candidate. So a unique combination of items. Not necessarily a completely unique form. That depends on the depth of the item bank. But however, typically we would see the average overlap, maybe 20% of the items, but it's not the same 20%. So it's clearly an advantage to have each candidate get a unique version. Then LOFT does use fixed length forms, which are intuitive and easy to explain. By pre-equating the forms allows easy comparison, and using classical test theory keeps the items on the scores on the same scale, so you don't have to rescale. You can talk in terms of percent correct and so forth. This method is proven to be practical with new banks as well as mature programs, and there's been considerable research to show that it is robust and that test items are rotated uniformly across the different forms, unlike other models. There's so much more I could say about this, but we're skimming the surface today. So quickly, let's consider, where is automated test assembly used today? As I mentioned, loft applications are very widespread, very predominant in licensing examinations and credentialing exams. I mentioned the National Academy of Sports Medicine as an example of a program that recently transitioned from fixed forms to loft. CAT, computer adaptive applications, as I mentioned, are less common, but there are some large programs in educational admissions, nursing, military, cognitive ability testing, where CAT is used. And I've listed a website here where you could look and see a listing of the major programs that use CAT. So I think as we consider now that we know how automated test assembly works, and we're able to generate a unique form of every candidate, and and at the same time, we're maintaining the content validity and equivalence of the forms, there's some really key benefits here. So we're maintaining measurement integrity. We're protecting the security of the exam. We're minimizing exposure. No candidates really see the same combination of items. It creates a significant barrier to cheating. No one can have a key to the test. And also, as a side benefit, as it turns out, automated test assembly has a lot of efficiency benefits in terms of cycle time, cost effectiveness in publishing exams, and the ability to rapidly replace items, pull them down, and so forth when needed. So in summary, I would just reiterate that ATA offers very efficient, cost-effective solutions that can help address security. And among ATA methods, my experience is that loft is particularly practical, a very practical approach to this. So it comes highly recommended. So with that, I will turn it to Adam.
Thank you, John. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. So we're going to go talk through remote proctoring or remote invigilation, what the considerations and best practices are. So the next slide, what I will cover is actually just what is remote proctoring, first of all, remote invigilation. So this is just the process of validating and ensuring both the integrity, so the actual candidate, who they are, and also the integrity of the exam itself taken in a remote location, so not in a classic test center sense. So I want to talk you through what the kind of modalities that are available. So the first one is live remote proctoring. So live remote proctoring is essentially where the authentication, which is the check-in process, so that making sure who they are, and that session, which is the candidate taking the test, is monitored in a live, real-time environment. The next modality is what we call record and review. So this is kind of classically an autonomous process whereby that authentication process, which is the same thing that a candidate has to do, and also the recording of the exam or the assessment happens not live, but as actually then reviewed post-event. So it happens after that test has been taken place. And then the last modality is the kiosk. So this is a PSI patented modality whereby we have a single seat piece of equipment, which is managed by PSI, but the authentication and the session monitored is performed by a live proctor. So it's kind of a hybrid between live proctoring and a center. And it proves particularly popular in those where you need more accessible sites and things like that. So the next slide kind of let's think about, okay, well, which modality would be right for your organization? So typically we kind of say higher stakes, exams use the live and kiosk modalities. And that is really because it brings in real-time processes and security controls. So the real-time authentication takes place on the candidate's check-in process. So looking at their photo, looking at their ID, and managing all of that. That takes place in real time. So the candidates will capture their photo, which is obviously them on the day. They'll show and demonstrate their ID, and that ID will be dependent upon your what rules and what identification that the program or the assessment requires. So it is customizable in that sense. And then lastly, it will be a room scan. So the candidate will be advised to demonstrate that they are in an environment where they are on their own and not having anybody or distractions around them. Once they've kind of done that, the next part in the actual with live remote proctoring is that the actual monitoring of the candidate session itself is being monitored live. So the proctors will be looking at what the candidate is doing, whether or not, and that's both from their webcam and also the screen and what they're interacting with on the test itself. So they will be being monitored, will be looked at, will be looking for any of those conditions or actions that may be not allowed by your program. And again, this is something that is customized with each organization, depending on what would they like to happen. If certain things happen, should they be talking, should they be using a notepad and things like that. So those proctors will be trained and will be looking at the kind of what is happening with that candidate in their test. And if you allow a notepad, then simply it's notified that they were looking at a notepad, but may not change the outcome of their test or the interaction of their test. Should there be things not allowed, like drinks, mobile phones, those sorts of things, obviously, that the proctor is seeing, then they obviously can be pre-trained with conditions that should something happen, then they will either pause the test, give a warning, or actually close that test down because it's not allowed and the rules have been broken. In addition to that, we obviously are delivering these tests using a secure browser. So candidates will not be able to navigate out, will not be able to see and go to sites that aren't actually allowed by the program itself. And it kind of does then protect and control the content itself there. So the next modality, which is record and review, this kind of could be a really good option for those where you've got maybe more of a medium or lower stakes, where you don't necessarily need that real-time control on closing those sessions down. You have the same authentication process, so you're capturing the ID, you're capturing the photo, and you're asking the candidate to do a room scan. But actually, once they've done that and that test is then loaded, the process of reviewing whether or not that session was compromised or anything like that is done post-event. So that PSI certified proctors will go through and will look at that candidate session and make a judgment, again, based upon those same rules that organizations may want to give. Now, why we say kind of medium or lower stakes is because it is post-event, it typically works well for those assessments where you may have time between tests being taken and results being released, because you can build into that process, making sure that those assessments being delivered were valid and were fair. So it's something that gives you that additional control, but also maybe without the practicalities and the issues operationally that you have with live proctoring. In terms of scheduling your test, you can deliver these more wide-scale, event-based testings and things like that. Now, they're all delivered using secure browser still, but it's not something that anybody can kind of interact with when that test is being taken. I'm going to talk a little bit more about AI, but obviously a little bit later on, but there are elements of AI that can be put in record and review as well for speeding up and making operational benefits with that kind of proctoring and invigilation process as well. So the last modality in terms of where you'd be looking at would be, okay, the kiosk. So this one really creates this really creates the convenience of what you can do with where the locations are. So if you're not sure about whether or not a candidate's PC itself is sufficient to deliver a type of test, Kiosk can be that kind of great in between, whereby you know the security and the integrity is being managed by the device itself, but the candidate's got the flexibility of going to a location and having a seamless process and experience in terms of taking their test. So these can be rolled out very, very easily, but they also do give you that real-time authentication with our certified proctors, and also that real-time monitoring of the test itself. So you get the kind of the best of both worlds from if you're concerned about delivering remote proctoring in those areas or on the candidates' PCs themselves. So if we just go to the next slide, John. So what is the role of AI? So it's obviously a very big buzzword within the industry, but actually there are some recognizable applications of AI within the assessment industry at the moment. So one of the kind of first ones is, and what kind of advancements have we made in this, is actually on that authentication piece. So verifying somebody's identity is of critical importance when taking an assessment. And one of the things we typically see are things around fake IDs, things around people changing photos and those sorts of things. But actually what we can do within AI now is actually put in services which monitor and take a measurement against these sorts of things. So within biometric identity, what we can actually do there is somebody captures their photo during that remote proctoring session and then captures their ID. And AI and machine learning can be used to mirror up that photo and that ID and give a percentage match. So we can perform that check on both, obviously the photo, is the person who they took their photo the same as what's on their ID. In addition to that, you can also actually run, is that ID of a valid format? And are there things within that ID that aren't correct? And this is where our AI can be used to kind of improve that process, apply that rigor and that control on top of potentially a human doing it as well. So there are services that you can have within that process, which improves the validity of that person. So this is a great way of actually just kind of speeding up and improving that journey for those candidates, but whilst giving organisations sound peace of mind that these people are who they say they are. Other applications of AI, and I mentioned it earlier on, is around analysing behaviours of people within taking this assessment. And there's two parts. There's the post, and John will talk a little bit later on of things we can do with AI and data forensic, but there's also during the assessment itself. So within the record and review proctoring technology, there are methods where AI can be running whereby somebody's behaviour is being monitored, and unusual behaviour can actually be picked up as part of the engine as well. So are they continually looking for eye tracking movement? Are they continually looking down? Are they picking up devices? And the AI can be running, and it can actually flag these events or triggers to the proctor when they're coming to review it post-event. So you can actually speed up the process of proctoring whilst also looking for the behaviours, because the more assessments that are being taken, the more behaviours that can be monitored, and you can actually then train the AI engine to kind of look at these behaviours across different programs. Obviously, this creates a wealth of data as well, not just in terms of assessment data, but in terms of this behaviour data. And this can then be used to continuously improve this whole process. So these are real usage and actual proper benefits of AI and machine learning within the proctoring journey. And as I mentioned a second ago, the more data we get, the more comprehensive and the better the outcomes and processes will be as we kind of move along. And that brings us on to kind of data forensics, John.
Thank you, Adam. So I'll wind up with just a brief review of our approach to data forensics to support test security. And I'll begin by defining data forensics as the application of statistical methods to detect anomalies in candidate data patterns, response patterns, that would be consistent with fraudulent test-taking behavior. So in other words, there are ways to identify what that behavior would look like in terms of data and to detect it. And that's what we're doing. So we really have two components to our data forensics program. The first one is surveillance. The second one is an investigation component that I'll turn to in a moment. But in terms of continuous surveillance or routine monitoring of an exam program, we're really focusing at three levels. We're looking at the level of the test taker, of course, the candidate. We're looking at the level of the school or site, looking at data at that level. And we also look at the test item or the test form level. We look at the test, the candidate, and the locations. And we're using metrics, we're using analytics to identify evidence at these different levels, things like looking for pre-knowledge, which would be of the content, so as if someone had unauthorized access to the content, which might be reflected through elevated pass rates, anomalous response times, and so forth. We look for evidence of cheating at the candidate level, certainly. We look for abnormal similarity between candidate responses. We look at test time. We look at score changes, and so forth. And then at the item or form level, we're definitely looking at the properties of exams and items and looking for drift. So we have the routine surveillance. We also have what I'd call more ad hoc investigations, that where an event is identified that needs to be investigated. Often these are brought to our psychometricians by the operations team. So in the data forensics program, there's a close working relationship between psychometricians and testing operations teams. So maybe there's some evidence on a security camera, maybe that comes up through Adam's remote proctoring techniques, and they would like further corroboration by looking at the candidate's response data, which is what data forensics can do. And so analytics would be conducted. Or there are just so many different scenarios, but that's one example. Now, in terms of whatever we're doing, whether it's routine surveillance or an investigation, there's a report that's generated, and this is just one example. But it's key to have a report that can describe the analytics and interpret the analytics and give information to really the consumers of these reports, who are typically people in testing operations, or sometimes the clients themselves are using these reports. They have internal staff. They may have a security officer, or they may have exam staff who are working with these reports. And so we're generating sort of these surveillance reports. It could be daily for some very large programs, or monthly, depending on the size. Within the report, we're generally flagging suspicious response patterns, and we bring those. We're saying this is likely to be a problem, very likely to be a problem, and we bring that to the attention of the operations team. They look for corroborating evidence on their side. They may go back and review a video, or they may go look for proctored incident reports. And then, as I mentioned earlier, for ad hoc investigations where, let's say, there might be suspicion that a testing location has some collusion going on. Maybe there's a proxy testing ring or something like that, and they want us to investigate that and look at the data, and that's where these analytics have proven to be very, very useful. So what are some of the metrics? We typically look at a suite of metrics. In our experience, there's really no one metric that can tell us whether there's a problem with a candidate, whether a candidate's cheated or whether there's a proxy test or so forth. We really rely on a suite of measures, and in combination, they give us good information, they give us good evidence that. So we're really focusing, typically, these aren't all the metrics, but typically they fall in these four categories of passing rates. Are they really elevated compared to any other location or other forms of the exam? Response similarity, so patterns of responses, are they highly similar between candidates? Far more similar than would be expected. Is the response time extremely high or long, extremely fast? Are people able to pass the test in an unreasonably short time? And conversely, are people taking a very, very long time to answer questions because they're trying to memorize the questions? And then there are just simply unexpected response patterns that we look for. So here's an example of what of a similarity index that PSI developed, and it really looks at all pairs of candidates. It looks at all of their responses to the questions on the exam, right answers and wrong answers, and it looks at that in context of the score level. Now, obviously, the higher the score that someone has, the number of correct answers, the more likely they're going to match other candidates. So that's taken into account. And in essence, this index looks at the degree of similarity between all pairs, their response choices, and it detects abnormally high matches. We have our own approach to this, kind of our secret sauce, where we've developed algorithms, sort of an AI approach to modeling data, to look at cases where there is no known cheating, and we develop prediction models for what the similarity index should be. And then we take those prediction equations and apply them to suspect data. Now, in this case, these colored circles represent suspected sites we were asked to investigate. And it shows that, and so it's color-coded into the three different sites. And these are candidates at those sites who have anything higher than 3 is an anomaly. And they really jump out. They really jumped out as being excessively similar compared to what they should have been. That's kind of an example. This is a quick look at what aberrant response time would look like. What we scale it, we standardize it to an index. It's based on, again, using benchmark data that we've conditioned based on large data sets that we have, and creating models. And we're really flagging cases that are extremely finishing the test abnormally quickly. And the blue vertical line represents the cut score in this case. So we're looking at people who pass the test, and they're doing it in far less time than is possible. So clearly someone is working with a key, or there's something going on here that needs to be investigated. And then lastly, I'll just illustrate, if we look at time and we kind of map time on top of similarity, in this case, we've sort of highlighted in red cases with elevated response times against the similarity index. And in the upper right quadrant, there's a lot of corroboration of, wow, these are cases that have extremely high similarity, and at the same time, they're finishing the test in an abnormally quick rate. And as it turned out, this was a case of proxy testing. Those cases up there, that was confirmed. And so in summary, with regard to data forensics, I'll just say this is, again, another approach, another tool in the arsenal to help protect programs against test fraud. And in this year alone, we have been running data forensics on about over 400 exams and over 600,000 examinees. We've run a number of investigations. One recent success was where we did uncover and corroborate proxy testing that was going on in several testing centers in India, and the results were very compelling, and the sites were eventually closed. And so when you think about this collection of test security methods, we've talked about automated test assembly, remote proctoring, online remote proctoring, enhanced online proctoring with using AI, and then adding data forensics. When you put all of these together, you've got a pretty powerful combination to help address some of the threats to test security. These are some references to some of the methods that we spoke about. And I believe at this point, we are opening up to questions from you who are on the line, if you would like to type them in.
John, I think we've actually got some already.
Okay.
I'm happy to read them out, and then John, I suppose I'll hand over to you for some of them, and then I'll take some of them myself. So,
okay, we'll see
from the top.
Yeah.
So we have a question from, does online proctoring prevent the learner from setting up a video recording device before the exam takes place to record the questions displayed on their screen during the exam? So it's a good question. So obviously it doesn't technologically stop any of that taking place, but that is why the pre-authentication piece is crucially important, both from capturing their photo, but the room scan, for both live and record and review. Once you've done the room scan, obviously that is showing you the environment. If that is not to a sufficient quality or to satisfy the proctor that actually they are on their own, there's nothing like that, then obviously they will not start that test. From a record and review process, then if it's captured during the fact of that room scan or during the actual exam itself, then that test can be invalidated. So it's key for people to look for those sorts of things, especially the proctors in both the review and in the live one as well. The next question is, can you give an example of a medium and low stakes test using the record and review modality? Okay, yeah, so it's really down to the organization's appetite for risk, really. We have non-critical, I suppose, non-life-threatening exams. That in the medical industry, they are using record, not record, so they're using live. They wouldn't use record for that side of things. But for digital literacy programs, for things like that, they are where these tests are, I say, not as critical, or they're part of an ongoing learning piece. They are the ones that will be used in record and review. Because again, it's not so critical that, and when the results are released at a later time, it's something that can be managed as part of that. So we could certainly look at discussing some specifics on an alternative call. John, I've got one for you. To identify changes in scores, would we need to build up a bank of data first, or input expected past performance data?
Yes, well, I would say there is a need to have benchmarks established. So there is that. Typically, we would go through a process to develop the benchmarks, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. So we would rely on historic data. We would look at carefully curated data to represent known samples and conditioned samples to ensure that the data are clean. In order to establish benchmarks for what would constitute a significant change for that exam program.
Excellent. Okay, the next one. Can you elaborate on secure browser? Are you talking about a secure bespoke client? That's exactly that. Yeah, the secure browser is just a lockdown browser that has to be either installed or it gets run from within like a Chrome extension or something like that. There's a couple of options. But that's what the secure browser is. Next question, we've got, how are proctors certified? That's really good. So PSI perform regular training and regular checking on the quality of our own proctors. So we kind of do recognise our proctors as being certified when they've met the criteria, the conditions that we set out. And this is quite a stringent set of conditions because we treat our proctors in the same sort of controls and processes that we have within our physical test centres itself. But remote proctoring is very, very different to being a test centre administrator or a test centre invigilator. They have to look out for specific things. So we've created a training program for this, working with our customers to make sure that we are covering all the key elements and the areas that they want to do. And once they've kind of met that, then we kind of certify our proctors. But there is continuous training, continuous improvement plans, continuous learning and annual assessments that our proctors have to go through in order to make sure they meet our kind of high standards. Got one for you, John, again. Does the data forensics work on all question types from multiple choice to essay style responses?
Oh, great question. Today, most of certainly the data forensics work that we're applying is on multiple response, multiple choice type questions. Now those could have different stimuli, of course, but ultimately there's either a single right answer or in some cases multiple answers that get weighted. Essay style questions are a completely different scenario, of course. And so modeling the similarity in between two essays or all essays is a completely different task, one that we're not undertaking today, but it's another frontier to be addressed, much more complicated, of course, would require natural language processing and so forth. But it's a great question, and I think that, I will say that organizations that do essay testing will sometimes supplement that with, they're really looking more at issues around plagiarism in essays and so forth. And so they may do checks. There is software available that's used to check for the content match to other essays, but we're not doing data forensics on essays.
Excellent, John. Right, Constance, we've got 3 minutes and we've actually got 3 questions remaining. So how long does the record and review process take? So from a candidate's perspective, it's obviously very quick, it's seamless, they get their ID and authentication and done like that. But the review process and how long does it take to actually get those sessions reviewed, it really depends on what the needs are of the client, whether or not they've got a quick turnaround time, the amount of tests. But these things can be turned around in under 24 hours, or if there's a longer period of time, it can be up to however long that organisation wants. So we use our same proctors to do that job, but it really just depends on how long it is. So it can be very quick, or it can be as long as you need it to be. And John, using CTT in automatic test assembly, what are the maximum size of items, assuming fixed length forms of items is used? What restrictions does it place on examinations as a whole or items used?
Well, I'll try to be succinct in answering this. So in classical test theory, there isn't technically a restriction. If I'm understanding the question correctly, there's not technically a restriction on the number of items on the fixed length form. Most exams are, 100 items or 200 items, and it's really about matching the test content to a blueprint or test content outline initially, and there's not really a restriction in that sense. But in terms of the constraints for using CTT in a loft application, which I think I'll just pick up that as a scenario for this case, the constraints we would place on the loft algorithm to assemble forms would be around ensuring representation of content domains. We would structure the classification of items such that to address issues around enemy items, cognitive levels, and things like that, if those are part of the exam concerns. And then I'll just say that the algorithm, lastly, I'll just say the way this works and why it works so well is it's not selecting at the item level, it's randomly selecting against a content domain, assembling a draft form, and then evaluating the properties of that form against a set of parameters. Let's say the mean, the variability of scores, the reliability and standard error of measurement. It looks at those against a very narrow tolerance and then either accepts a form or rejects it. So, so in that sense, and so I'll just leave it there. So I'll leave you the last minute, Adam.
No, that's fine. I think we've had a flurry more of questions, but so what I will ensure we do is that we've got people who ask the questions. I will make sure we get the responses back to you because some of these are very, very good questions. So yeah, I suppose on that time, I would like to say thank you for everyone for listening. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, I hope to meet you all soon.
Same here. Thank you, everyone.